Hi, this is Caroline Leavitt, and I'm the co-founder of A Miter Blaze, the book initiative that began the day of lockdown in an attempt to help indie bookstores whose stores were shuttered, authors whose tours, like mine, were canceled in the pandemic, and readers who wanted to connect with authors. We've grown a lot. I keep saying we're now like, we've stopped being a baby, a toddler. We're now moving into childhood. It's been 6 years now, I think. Today is really special. First of all, because it is February 6th, which is actually the anniversary that Jessica Soffer, who's our guest today, just told me was when she found out that her book, This Is a Love Story, was going to be a Read with Jenna pick. So that's really completely thrilling. Her book, I have a copy somewhere here, and I forgot to pull it out to show you the cover. The book is fabulous. It's one of my, oh yes, thank you so much, Jessica. The book is absolutely fabulous. It's one of my favorites. I didn't get to read it a year before, but I did get to read it early in galleys. And the moment I read it, I just flipped out for it. It's just magnificent. So let me tell you a little bit about Jessica, the book, read some of the praise, and then we'll talk. So Jessica Soffer earned her MFA at Hunter, where she was a Herzog Fellow. Her work has appeared in Granta, Vogue, and the New York Times, among other publications. Her father, a painter and sculptor, immigrated from Iraq to the United States in the late 1940s. She teaches fiction at Connecticut College and lives in New York City. So art, marriage, parenthood, family. This Is a Love Story is basically about two extraordinary people, Abe and Jane. They're in love, and their story is surrounded by and impacted by Central Park. Jane is dying, but Abe is determined to keep her present, which he does by telling us stories about their lives. And we follow her and Abe, their grown son, Max, and another woman who impacts their relationship, Alice, throughout the book. And it's just a devastatingly beautiful novel. So let's look at the praise. Ian Napolitano says, written with delicate and beautiful brushstrokes. This is a love story of a long marriage, a love story of Central Park, a story of how hard life can be and how the hard leaves its mark, but the love does too. Every once in a while I read a novel and think, what a gift. This is one of those books. Nathan Englander says, this is Jessica Soffer's iridescent, kaleidoscopic home run of a novel. It's a beautiful book of seasons, marking the cycles of a city, a family, the creative process, and a single and singular life. Jenny Jackson says, with her lyrical, graceful novel of love and art, Jessica Soffer has captured the glittering magic of New York City. Absolutely. And finally, from Liz Moore, This Is a Love Story is a revelation, the kind of novel to read in one sitting. It performs the magic trick of being a highly specific story that feels universal and timeless. When you finish, you'll find that your whole worldview has been gently and deftly altered by an author whose tenderness towards her characters and towards language itself is unparalleled. So there you have it. Thank you so much for being here, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me and for the kind words about my book.
Oh, absolutely. I could go on forever about the book. So, I'm always really interested, not in the question, where do you get your ideas, which I find a totally annoying question, actually, but I'm interested in what was haunting you or obsessing you that led to the inception of this book.
That's such a nice way of starting any conversation. I think I have always been deeply concerned with loss. I had a father who was ill for a lot of my childhood and my adolescence. He passed away when I was in my early 20s. And so I just was very aware of mortality from the get-go. And so it is at the forefront of my mind all the time. And so when I started working with Abe and Jane, these two characters, which really have been consistent for a long time. I've worked with them for, 7 years now. And their story was definitely one of loss. Jane was dying and Abe was recounting her life from the time that they meet until the time that she passes away. And that has been throughout, that this has been a story of sort of a woman ill. But the more time I spent with them, the more it became clear that their story was also a really profound and true love story. Their relationship is, though fraught like any long-term relationship, like any marriage, is also deeply loving and affectionate and supportive and reciprocal. And so I found myself, instead of writing about the things that keep me up at night, like you say, more about the things that also that sort of keep me going, because I feel lucky enough to be sort of surrounded by love. And that's what this book became. It became a book about love, though at first it certainly wasn't.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. The book also is separated into seasons and time periods. And I wanted to ask you, how do you feel that both love and art sustain and nurture us, and at different times?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I feel it more than ever right now. I don't know if you feel that way, but I feel the world is so frenetic
Yes.
and chaotic and
Yes.
truly difficult in a way that
Mhm.
I haven't known it to be in my adult life until, right now it feels at the pinnacle of that. And the two things that I find solace and salvation in again and again are love and art. The books that have kept me going, that have sort of brought me back from the cliff, are the ones that are filled with love, and not necessarily just a Pollyanna version of love. I mean, actually, never,
Right.
but rather love that is earned, love that comes after heartbreak, love that kind of repairs. And again and again, I find that in art. I find it in visual art. I find it in literature. So I think love and art is sort of, for at least for me, sort of all we have.
Right. Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree with that. That's why I'm so down on artificial intelligence, because I think it takes away that spark that does create art and moves out to other people and connects them. So I had to ask about Central Park. I never call setting because I feel that setting should be a character. So I always call it story world. And indeed, in this book, Central Park is story world. What is it about that park? Why did you have these characters revolving around it?
The answer, I think, is sort of twofold. One, I grew up near Central Park. I spent a lot of time in there. It was the backdrop of my life, essentially, and continues to be. I mean, as a child, I was there all of the time. And then now, because I don't live in the city anymore and I don't have a residence there, every time I go back to the city, I sort of end up in the park. It feels like my home. It feels where I'm most comfortable. And most of the most important moments of my life have happened in that park. Um, but for these characters, I wrote them actually during COVID. A lot of the book was written during COVID, and I thought so much about Central Park. I think, as a lot of us did, we kind of, our imagination got
Right.
the best of us, and we found ourselves returning again and again to a place in our mind that has left a mark, a really meaningful mark.
Mhm.
The place that slows us down, the place that allows us to kind of look at the world, to learn about humanity, whatever it is. And for me, that was Central Park. And so in the novel, it really is the kind of backdrop of their lives, but also
Yeah.
kind of witness, a bellwether, a homing device, all the things.
Yeah, I often say that if anything ever happened in Central Park, New York City would be destroyed, because it's the one place that no matter what neighborhood you live in, you love it. You just love it because it's that exceptional. I wanted to ask, your parents were both artists. Your dad was a working artist and your mom's an author. Did you what lessons did they teach you, or did you pick up by osmosis? And were there any cautionary tales about, you know, what it's like to be an artist in the world and the difficulties and the pleasures?
I have to say, in terms of cautionary, no, which I think is
That's
sort of,
great.
yeah, truly extraordinary. I mean, I think for them, they had day jobs for most of their careers in order to sustain their art. My dad had, a good amount of success, but success in the art world doesn't necessarily mean,
Doesn't right,
it
right.
doesn't necessarily translate. And my mom held many jobs while I was growing up in order to create art. And so there was this sense that art was the most important thing. Art is, at the peak of everything and necessary, and also not the only thing, that it has to be kind of worked into a life. And so for me, I held other jobs for all of my adult life in order to sustain my art. And so I don't know, I wouldn't say it took the pressure off, because it definitely did, but there's a way in which it felt like the best of things. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. What jobs did you have? I'm just curious, because I've had a range of stupid ones.
I did a lot of babysitting, nannying. I worked for an interior designer for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. I've taught in all the places, undergrads, MFAs, in workshops. I've done retreats. I've just taught and taught and taught. So those are the big jobs.
Okay. I'm always curious about whether writers feel that they learn skills from a past book that they bring to their new book, because I never feel that, but I always ask anyway. Tomorrow There Will Be Apricots was your first novel, I believe, right? Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything from writing that novel that you put into This Is a Love Story, or was This Is a Love Story a completely different book altogether?
Gosh, it's such a good question. I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's cumulative. It's all the stuff. So,
right.
I've been at it for a long time now. I've been writing novels since I graduated from my MFA program when I was 23. And there is one novel that lives in a drawer that happened between Apricots and This Is a Love Story. And I think that book actually taught me the most about what is necessary for a novel. That book, I felt, was the best thing I'd ever written. And it turned out it was sort of unpublishable because it was so obtuse. It was very meta. It was a writer writing about writing. And it was just tough. It was a really tough book. And I think I learned a lot about like what's necessary for forward momentum, character development, all those things from I don't want to say the failure of that book, but
no, it just was, that's so interesting. That's so interesting to hear that. So what is necessary for the momentum?
Great question. Something. Momentum is necessary. I think maybe that was the lesson, is that momentum is necessary, that you can't just have 200 pages of what feels like really beautiful writing and some character development. Things need to happen. Shit needs to happen.
Right. So that leads me to the question that I'm fascinated by, which is, how did you structure this? The pacing and the structure, the memories of Jane and then of Abe and then Alex and Max, it sort of swerves the narrative line, but it does it so beautifully, and it all fits together perfectly. And I also want to say, in terms of the language, because you were talking about your second novel, which was mostly gorgeous language and it didn't have enough narrative drive. The language in this was sort of just enough so we stop and gasp, but not so much that we stop and say, wait, what's happening now? How did you structure this? Did you always know the structure was going to be this way, or did it come sort of intrinsically?
No, for a long time I worked with just Abe and Jane, and I thought it was really going to be their narrative, just the two of them. And it was a very kind of nuclear, very insular story. And then I worked on that for a long time and tried actually to publish it, and it just was too narrow. And so I had a friend read it, and she said, who's a writer, and she said, this feels like just one part of the love story. And so at that point, it was very interesting. It was revelatory. Yeah. And at that point, I really felt like I need to make something happen. I need to shift not only the narrative, but the way that I'm entering the narrative. And so I made myself a schedule. I mean, I really kind of broke it down in a way that I never taught before, in a way that I never imagined myself doing. But I made myself a schedule. It involved word count and exactly what would happen in each section, character by character.
Wow.
To it. And in 3 months, I tripled the length of the book and just kind of inserted who needed to go where. And it became very logistical and mathematical in a way that earlier in my career, I would have said undermined creativity in some way.
Right.
But at that moment, I felt like, in fact, I don't feel like it did at all. I think actually those constraints allowed me to really expand. And now I can't imagine writing a book another way, to be totally honest.
That's great. That's great. I love that. I always feel that every book has to have a skeleton, and once you find that skeleton, then the rest is like, it's like hair, skin tone, clothes, whatever else you put on it, but it's kind of a lifesaver all the time. I also love the relationship between Jane and Abe so much because for me, so much of it was about what makes a love story, how the bond is tested, and and how it becomes stronger. And I love the whole way he was with that. She was suffering. I mean, I had a period in my life after I had my son where I was critically ill in a hospital for a couple of months and not expected to survive. And I remember when I got out of it, one of the nurses came over and said, do you know, like, your husband is the only husband on this floor who has come every day to see his wife. She said, people don't do that. They can't handle it. They feel guilty. They go out and they do whatever else. And that was actually the one thing that made me love my husband more than so many other things, because it's how you are in adversity that is really meaningful. And it sort of predicts how you're going to go the long haul together. I wanted to ask, with that question in mind, can you tell me how Abe is doing now, years later, in your mind?
I think as well as a person can do when they've lost the love of their life and when they're aging and when the reality of life is that it's very, very hard. I think Abe is a realist. I think he's a romantic, but I think he's a realist. And so I think that I think he's still writing. I believe that he's still writing. I believe he's still going to the park, but I believe that the loss in his heart will never be replaced by anyone or anything.
Right. Well, grief just has a way of sticking its burr. It's sticking to you like a burr. So I want to also talk about Max, who insists he doesn't need love or intimacy because he wanted it so badly from Jane, his mom, who seemed to his mind, love art more than she did him. And that brings up a question to me that a lot of female authors, and I'm not talking about this now, but I think a while ago, like a decade ago or so, there was a big deal about how women authors were saying, you should have kids because that's another novel you could have written instead. And that always irritated me because I always feel like you can hold two ideas at once and you can have both. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about Max and how you think that you can hold those two ideas together.
Well, I can speak from experience. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and it definitely doesn't make the writing easier, but I also feel like it gives a lot to the writing. I mean,
I think it does too.
Her lack of sort of creative inhibition has been really meaningful to watch. And I think also the issue of time, I have much less time now because I'm chauffeuring her to school and picking her up and taking her to play. And I actually find that the limits are a blessing. I know that I have a certain number of hours in the day, and I work in them and towards them. And so I at once completely understand and empathize and wrote a character who at her core really struggles with the idea of creating art and also being a parent. But I also think that there can be real beauty in that position. And I also don't think it's really specific to art. I mean, I think that art requires a lot from us.
Right.
Certain people more than others. Like, for example, my father, he lived in his art. He had to go away for long stretches of time to be with it. And I think Jane happened to be that sort of character too, which is probably lesser represented in fiction in the world for women. But I also think that for anyone who has a passion, whether it be cooking or working out or crocheting or painting, there is something that is lost in, not lost, but something that is compromised when you have a child.
Right. But that's what life is anyway. All these little compromises, you try to get a bit of this and a bit of that. Your book about apricots was about two lonely people who found common solace in food. I also read a piece by you about your love of junk food, particularly Malamars, which we always keep on stock in my household. So tell us about your love of junk food, and do you still have it?
I don't. It was really a moment in time. My father grew up in Baghdad and came from a very kind of healthful way of life.
Right.
And when I grew up, there was nothing junky in our house, and I longed for it. And so I, of course, like any kid would do, I started, stealing it whenever I could, going to friends' house and looking in their pantries and wanting for it when I couldn't have it. And so there was a moment of time where that was my form of rebellion, I think, was the junk food. And then after a while, it started to make me feel crummy, as it does. And
Right.
started just going back to the way that my father and mother had eaten when I was growing up, which was incredibly healthfully. And it's funny because I think one can fall into the habits that you're grown with. And so now it's very natural for me to order like hot water and lemon at a restaurant, which is what my dad did my whole life. And actually, he was so ahead of his time. I mean, he was eating quinoa and kale and all the things well before it was trendy.
Oh,
so
that's so great.
I grew up at vegetarian restaurant, like weird vegetarian restaurants at holes in the walls. And now that's my happy place. And I don't know if it's just nostalgic or in order to honor him or to fight time, whatever it is, but
I think it's both. I think it's both because it is a lovely kind of honoring. But the truth is, when you eat really healthy, try to be vegan, you do feel better.
You do
feel better. There's a kind of energy there. I wanted to talk about a few statements I've heard you made that just really grabbed me. One of them was about creating character, and it said the character tells you what's next, not you. And I loved that. Can you talk about that?
That is true on good days. I mean, sometimes it's such a slog. You're pushing the character where they, theoretically don't want to go, and you're just trying to make things happen on the page. But when things are going, when you're working at a steady clip, that's what happens. The character sort of starts to dictate, and you're just transcribing. And that's what we all hope for. That is the dream as an author, to just sit there and take dictation.
That's what I call the zone, when you get in that space, and it's just amazing. It's so much more fun than trying to structure stuff. But I love that statement. It was really great. You have another statement about writing that I also love, where it said, writing doesn't change disorder, it holds it. Tell us about that. That's a brilliant quote.
I am one of these people that has been writing my whole life in journals, poetry as a young person. I have needed writing in order to make sense of the world. And of course, like I said, it doesn't change things, but it does change your, I don't know, biochemistry. It does change your mind. It does allow you to kind of not spiral out, which I think as writers is really natural. And especially now, I mean, I find like so many people, my anxiety is really at an all-time high. And it certainly helps to be working. It certainly helps to be writing in whatever form.
I think it does too. There was a period of time where I just felt I should stop writing and just, be a political activist or just go out and do something else that's useful to others. And I found that I got more and more anxious and more cranky. And it was sort of like a bell going off in my head. You need to write, and there's nothing wrong with that because that makes you able to do other things. But I totally agree. I think it's definitely it's a psychological thing too, where you need it like a vitamin to feel better.
And when I start to feel crummy, I look at all the things. Am I exercising? Am I getting outside enough?
Right.
Water. Oh, I'm not writing. And usually that's the one.
Absolutely. So are you still doing your weekly writing prompts? I read that you did that. Yeah. Tell us about those and what has the response been?
So before my daughter was born, so maybe 5.5 years ago, a little more than that, I guess, I started sending out these weekly writing prompts, and they're short and they're sort of emphatic and they're sometimes open-ended. And I send them out on every Wednesday morning to subscribers, whoever subscribes, and people can either respond or not respond. Sometimes people will write in a journal and send me a photograph of their response. During COVID, the response was overwhelming.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I had hundreds of responses a week in my inbox, and I respond to every one of them. My response has been slow lately. If anybody's listening, forgive me, I'll get there. But I do try to respond. I do respond to every single response that I get. And some people, I think, just read it and let it marinate throughout the day or the week. Some people will hold off and do a whole chunk of them one after another. And they're meant to be meditative, revelatory, um, comforting, surprising, all the things, just enough to get us out of the muck.
Can you give us one?
Sure. So sometimes last week, I think it was to write about your favorite body of water in the most specific way that you can. And people wrote about incredible things. I mean, some people wrote about being in their bathtub and the safety of their bathtub. And some people, of course, wrote about the water in Croatia.
Right.
Some people wrote about cold water, and some people wrote about warm water. And so all the things. And I think it's never wrong to write. You never feel worse for doing a writing prompt. And most of them I say, in certain cases, I'll tell people to put their timer on for 2 minutes, or sometimes I'll have them write to a song. And the song is never longer than 3 minutes. And sometimes I know that people adhere to the 2 or 3 minute timeline, but sometimes people will write for a really long time. And that can be so satisfying, I think.
It is satisfying. That's absolutely great. You also did lifestyle writing. I saw some of your articles, which I think is fabulous because I love the juxtaposition of a serious poetic writer who actually is very interested in lipstick or skin creams or whatever else. I mean, I've certainly written articles like that before, and it's kind of important, I personally feel, because you get to stretch out in the world. Is writing these kind of articles something that you love to do? And are there weird things that particularly interest you? Like, are you a skincare fiend, or do you just look for people with odd habits?
I do love skincare. I have been talking about this meme that keeps coming across my feed lately, and it says, I'm either talking about skincare or death, which is 100% true. I feel like whenever I meet up with a friend lately, we're talking about death and destruction, and then in the same breath about
Skincare.
Which I think will save us all. Skincare will save us all. So I do love writing these lifestyle pieces. Part of that, I think, is because I do write these kind of heady, long novels. They take me a long time. And so the satisfaction of writing an essay and being able to
right.
it is really immense and very true. So that's part of why I like writing them. And I also like writing. I loved writing about food with Apricots. I did a lot of kind of publicity pieces that had everything to do with food. And it's a joy to write about food. There's not too much food in this book, but there's never not food, I think.
Right. Well, food is definitely something you want to put in there. I always ask this question to writers because it tells more about me than the writer. And I want to know, what's obsessing you now and why, beside the political situation?
Beside the political situation. Well, right now I would say love. Like, I feel this book is really fueled by love, and not across the board love, not easy love. Jane loves her son, but she struggles with postpartum. Abe and Jane love each other, but they struggle. There's this kind of love that happens over many years, love that is earned, that I'm really in love with. And I think this book is really fueled by that idea. And I find also that I live in this community that is incredibly supportive. I have a lot of mom friends now, and I adore them. And I just feel like I'm sort of surrounded by love, and I'm so grateful for that. So, yeah, that's where I am.
You know what? That whole idea of community is so, so important, especially if you're a writer, because it can be isolating. And, I found that out when I was pretty much a loner when I started a Mighty Blaze, and I began interacting with all these people all of a sudden. And to my surprise, I really loved it. It's really nice to be able to talk with other people and to connect. Oh, you have a question. Let me show it. Okay. This is from Renee. Thank you, Renee. Jessica, how did you feel when you heard your book was picked by Jenna?
There was a really amazing moment. My editor and agent, whom I love so deeply, they're family now, they called me, and I began to cry because it was so overwhelming and so surprising. I worked on this book for a long time and really didn't know if it was going to be publishable in the end, and was sort of on the brink of wondering whether or not I could continue having a career as a writer, which is really a tricky place to be in, I'll say. So when it was picked, of course, I started to cry. And my daughter, who was maybe 4-ish at the time, came over to me and said, "Did they hurt your feelings?" That was her response, was she felt protective, and sort of that was her understanding of what I was.
Wow, that's so sensitive of her.
Very sensitive of her. And we've talked a lot about, what happy tears are, what they mean. And so I guess I can't say the level of joy that I felt, only because Jenna really gives people wings. There is a level of exposure that you get from a book
Right,
club, so
right.
immense. And the book would have been the book, but this is different. This is different, and it's wild.
I think it's actually really important what you said, that you felt that. I mean, to me, reading that book, I thought, oh my God, this is, before everything happened, I thought this is a perfect, perfect novel. But to hear you say that you didn't know if it was publishable or if your career was going to continue, I always tell writers that I work with that I'm always suspicious of the writers who say, this is the best thing I ever wrote. This is like so good, because usually it's problematic. But when a writer says, I don't know if this is any good, I don't know if anybody's going to like it, then it's usually because there's something great and deep in there. And so I want to ask, so do you have fears anymore about your career? And that's a serious question, because even though you have this great, huge thing, you're still a writer, and the publishing business is very weird right now.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things. One, I feel like now I have an editor and agent who I rely on in a way that I didn't have before. And so I feel like I'm supported in that way, and I won't go down a rabbit hole like I did with the book that lives in a drawer. I won't let myself go down that far, and hopefully there will be kind of checks along the way. So I'm very grateful for that and excited for that, to feel like there's something more collaborative. But, the other thing is, I really just love to write. I mean, I deeply, deeply love to write. It's who I am. It's who I imagine that I will always be. And so just to be able to continue to do that is what I'm here for. It's really not for anything else. And so I'm working on the next book, although not this week. And the joy will be finishing that book. That's what it is about for me.
Can you say anything about the new book, or do you feel like you just wanted to marinate for a long time before you talk about it?
I am happy to talk about it, because I feel like
excellent.
Before. So it's about 4 mothers and who live in the same town. They have kids at the same school, and there's a kind of sexual assault scandal that rocks the community and rocks them as mothers. And there's something really redemptive about it, something dark, something uplifting, all the things.
That sounds great. That sounds absolutely great. So I want to tell everybody out there, thank you for coming. Thank you for the comments and questions. Robin said, I'm so thankful for these author events. It feels like chatting with such special friends. I absolutely agree. I feel like that too. Diane Dickey says, I'm looking forward to reading this book. And I think those are the comments. So anyway, I want to repeat again, I've got to put up a link in the comments for all of you so you can order this novel. It's absolutely spectacular. It's bookshop.org, in case you don't feel like looking for the link. Please tune in next week when I'll see you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Jessica, for being here. I'll see all of you next week. And Jessica, you just hold on. Bye, everybody.